This video is entitled Action Plans and follows along with Chapter 8 in the Project Plus study guide. This is specifically for the class Project Management for Technology. I'm James Reneau Ph.D. from Shawnee State University, and I'll be taking you through this presentation on communication plans. In this video, we're going to cover the deliberate nature of communication. We're going to talk about the communication plan, and we're going to talk about the communication trigger plan and triggers of communications. Good communications aren't accidental. It takes planning of how and when we're going to communicate. The author of our book suggests that we create a communications plan to help us decide when and how to best communicate with our stakeholders. I'm going to show that in the next slide. Here is a sample communications plan taken from our textbook. It has several columns, and I want to go through each of the columns and why we include them. The first is the stakeholder name or the stakeholder group that we're going to be communicating with. The sponsor, stakeholder A, Bob, Wilma, Mary, Nancy. Who else are we going to communicate with? There could also be certain teams that we communicate with. We're going to describe what kind of communication type we're going to give them. Project status reports, monthly summaries, the project plan, the project. Notice how project status reports go out to different people. We're going to define the communications format that we're going to use with those individuals. Are we going to email them? Are we going is it going to be verbal communications? Are we going to meet with face to face? Are we going to video communicate them? Write down how we're going to distribute it to them. Are we going to just upload it to a network share drive and say, well, there they go, they got the report, or at least they can go get it whenever they want? Or are we going to send it to them directly? Is it going to be a hand delivery? Is it going to be a phone call? Again, how are we going to distribute this communication? Who's responsible for doing the communication? Because in a communication plan, when you have teams and team members and sponsors and all kinds of other individuals involved in a project, each of them are going to communicate. So we need to define who's responsible for each of the communications, who's going to send it. So the stakeholder name would be the receiver. The responsible party would be the transmitter or sender. The frequency, how often are we going to do it? Um, Weekly, daily, monthly, quarterly? I don't know. How often are we going to do it? We should also include, excuse me, the level of detail. Is this an individual who needs all of the details, or is this someone who just needs a brief summary of the communication of what's going on? And each communication we have with them may be at different levels. And then lastly, the author suggests that we put a confidential column to define, is this a communication that we don't want to share with other team members, or if this gets out, that's okay. That's maybe something to consider, especially when we're dealing with communicating how teams are working, interpersonal relationships, individual problems, issues, and those types of things. And maybe we're discussing risks that we don't want to communicate with a wider stakeholder community. So she suggests that we create this plan and be deliberate in our communications. And I have to agree. So this slide just reiterates and reinforces what I just said before. We need to create a plan of how we're going to engage each individual or group of stakeholders. What do they need to know? When do they need to know it? And how much do they need to know? Those are questions that you need to ask yourself early in the process of putting a project together, and plan your communications deliberately. The author also suggests that we create a stakeholder engagement plan for each group of stakeholders. So there would be one of these for each group of stakeholders that goes into what we're going to discuss, the key points, the supporting detail of how why, what, and when dealing with the project. So create a plan for each group of stakeholders in addition to the original plan. This is how we're going to engage them. Often we need to communicate when an event happens. When something happens, it will cause us to need to communicate. Maybe a risk that we thought might happen happened and things change, or a change order comes through, and we'll talk about those in the next chapter. So, what are we call those events? We call those triggers that trigger communication, audits, planning adjustments, project changes, schedule changes, updating risks. We completed a milestone. Yay! We didn't complete a milestone. Boo. Um, Tasks start, tasks complete, resources change, legal changes, zombie apocalypse. I mean, there could be all kinds of things that will trigger communications. And you need to identify what the ones you're expecting are going to be and include them in a communication trigger report or trigger plan, and we'll talk about that. In fact, here it is, the communication trigger plan, where we list the trigger, um, where we list the stakeholders that need to be communicated to because of the trigger. We need to define a reason, the method, and the timing of the notification so that we know what to do. When there's a project change, we notify the sponsor and affected stakeholders. We obtain approval. We have a project change management meeting, maybe. So there we go. Maybe the risk register updates, and instead of just being generic with this risk register updates, maybe there are certain risks that we would list as a trigger. If this risk happens, this triggers this set of communications. If this risk happens, this triggers a different set of communications with different stakeholders for different reasons and different methods. So the communication trigger plan is also something to create and to keep in mind as we deliberately communicate. The book page images that were included throughout this presentation were taken from Kim Heldman's 2017 CompTIA Project Plus Study Guide Exam, second edition. There's a reference to it. Again, those were not my work of authorship, and the copyright maintains hers with those individual pieces, and they were used under fair use. The presentation is copyright 2020 by James Reneau Ph.D., except for those parts that were taken from um, Kim Heldman's book. You can contact me at jreneau@shawnee.edu. This work is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial Share Alike 4.0 International License, and I would like to say thank you for watching another one of these.